This video is an overview of Chapter 1, Review and Preparation, and it has two major parts to it. First, the introduction or the review of certain mathematical techniques that are important to understand for manipulating data in spreadsheet software, and the second part is a general introduction to both tabular data and some important features of spreadsheet software in order to manipulate your data for an effective data visualization. So what you see before you is a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet and, what's more, tabular data. That's because these data exist within a table. What is a table? It's comprised of two main components. Firstly, you have columns. These are most often called variables, but in some cases they're called fields. And you also have rows. And rows are horizontal and are most often called observations, but they have other names such as instances or cases. We'll be calling them observations in this workshop. And again, variables in lieu or in place of columns. So when you click on these little boxes that get highlighted in your tabular data, these are called cells. And cells are created by the intersection between a column and a row. And so inside that cell live values. Usually, in some cases you can have missing values, but we're not going to get too much into that. So in this particular case, this column, unique words, is actually showing us the top 15 artists in terms of the largest vocabulary size for the unique amounts of lyrics. Now, as I said, you can essentially be able to identify or distinguish each of these values that live inside these cells because they exist at the intersection of a column and a row. In this case, A5 for Jedi mind tricks. But you can also reference using column letters and row numbers in order to be able to create what are called formulas. Formulas exist up here in the formula bar and are indicated by this sort of cursive F, if you will. And in order to best show how we use the intersection of columns and rows in order to identify a particular value, we can actually create a new variable, and we're going to do that right now. This variable is going to be called proportion. Why proportion? Well, because 7,392 unique lyrics for A$AP Rock out of 35,000, it's really only telling us the greatest number of unique words. But what is the proportion of those words out of a total 35,000? And so this is why it's actually important to have a basic understanding of the order of operations as well as arithmetic. So let's create a formula. Now, in order to do that, you have to select the cell or cells that you would like. And up here, we are actually able to manipulate or enter our custom formula, or we can simply do that down in the cell. And I can click on the cells that I want to exist inside the formula, and they will automatically appear. Now, what's interesting is that you can actually reference not only a single cell, but you can reference multiple cells. First, let's finish this formula. So we want the number of unique words divided by 35,000. Awesome. So that becomes 0.211. In other words, 21% of all of A$AP Rock's first lyrics that he released on albums were, in fact, unique words. The rest were duplicates or repeat words, if you will. They were not unique. Now, what we did there was, again, we used the column letter and the row number in order to reference the intersection of B2, and at that intersection lives the value that we wanted to use. It was 7,392. Then we used a hard number, 35,000, and we were able to create this custom formula. You can also actually reference an entire body of these intersections, or in other words, these labels for each cell starting with A2 and ending with B16. And if I were to press enter, then we've actually created an entire replica of all, then we've actually created an entire replica of all of the data that really live in these initial columns. What's interesting about that is changes to these data will actually change these data here, because these exist solely in reference to these data. In fact, we can see that in the formula bar that this is A2 through B16, whereas when we look at the formulas for a sub roc here, it's simply a sub roc. It's not even a formula at all. It's a value. So when we change GZA to, for example, Big Daddy Kane from the golden age of hip hop, we also see that that is changed over here in this cell. And that's because this, again, is referencing the data and the values that exist over here. So I'm going to get rid of this now that that's been explained. And so referencing cells, a single cell or multiple cells, is really the essence to data transformation in spreadsheets. In other words, in this case, we're using the reference to B2, and we can also simply do B3 divided by 35,000. And instead of clicking, we can even manually write that out. So in this case, we're going to use B4. And in fact, when I do that, this cell automatically becomes highlighted because I've referenced the cell B4. And then we'll divide that by 35,000. So cool. These are all more or less the same formulas. And what's more is that you can actually click on this little square here at the bottom of a selection. This is called a handle. And if you do that, you can drag the formula so that it applies to every single row. And now this assumes B6 for row 6, B7 for row 7, etc., etc. So let's make another variable to explain why algebra is important. So let's call this rounded. In rounded, we're going to create something down here called rounding value. And rounding value is going to take on the number 1. This will all make sense in a second. But essentially what we want to do here is very simple. We're going to initiate a formula by pressing equals. We're going to say that we want to take the value of C2. So in that case, I'll just click on it. And we're also going to multiply that by the value here in rounding value in C18. If I press enter, well, the rounding value is 1. So no surprise there. If you multiply something by 1, it's just going to give you the same number, right? Now let's go ahead and, I've got to lock this in. Don't worry about this too much because you won't be doing any operations like that. But if I click and drag the handle, we can also get the rounding of proportion. Essentially, it's just a repeat of this number, right? But there's something critical, and this is where algebra really comes into play. And what is that? Well, if we change this value, which isn't a formula at all, it's just a hard number that lives in the formula bar. If we change that, then we're changing the value of C18 to take on a new value, and thus we change the formula, which is essentially the same thing as algebra. X plus 3 equals 5, solve for x. Well, x would equal 2 because 2 plus 3 equals 5, right? Awesome. So in this case, if we change 1 to 10, what's going to happen? Now, these are no longer the same as the initial proportion values that we referenced. Now they're times 10 because we've multiplied it, we've changed that value. So there's a sort of flexible relationship that occurs in this formula. And this allows for a lot of really great techniques in spreadsheet software, which is quite nice. But what's more, this is essentially saying that 2 out of every 10 lyrics, 2.1 out of every 10 lyrics are unique, but we can even go further than that, and we can say 21% or 21 out of 100 lyrics are unique. All the way down to the roots, we have 16 out of 100 or 16.5%. Those are also percentages. So that's the importance of algebra, using a sort of flexible value there, as well as the importance of arithmetic and understanding those when it comes to manipulating data in spreadsheets. Lastly, we can always use, and I'm going to go ahead and delete this, because what happens when we delete a referenced cell? We get a reference error. That's because we're telling it to multiply it by something that no longer exists. So we'll get rid of that. And lastly, we'll go over functions. Now, what are functions? You can think of them kind of like an oven. You put ingredients inside of an oven, and if it's the right amount of ingredients, hopefully, and it's set to the right temperature, and it's set to some other specifications, those ingredients, in this case, those data, are going to come out of that oven on the other side as a sort of cooked or transformed product. Now, that may sound simple, relatively. Essentially, a function transforms a value or a group of data. But functions can be extraordinarily advanced, and there are a ton of them. So how do we use a function? Well, again, we create a formula. And how do you create a formula? You initiate it by pressing equal. And we're going to use a very simple function here, and it's simply sum. Now, after you name, and actually this is a good moment to say, to point out just how many functions there are. So if I start with a drop-down kind of tooltips appears with all of the functions that start with that letter, B, C. In this case, if we did AV, we have everything that starts with, there's the function average, which you can probably assume what that does. And we're just going to do the function sum. And after you name the name of a function, you have to follow that with a pair of parentheses. What's helpful about spreadsheet software is oftentimes it gives you the specifications that you need inside of that function in order to make it work, in order to help it successfully transform your data in the way that you're trying to get it transformed. With sum, it's pretty straightforward, and it tells you first you use the first number, then you use the second number, and then you use the third number, ad infinitum, all the way to 100, 1,000, 1 million different values, and you're essentially getting the sum of all of those values. We can enter those manually, 1, 2, and 7. And of course, that's going to give us 1 plus 2 equals 3 plus 7 equals 10. But what's more, we can also simply reference the values. Now, if I simply choose B2 through B3, we will get the sum of those two unique lyrics. But let's say I want to do the entirety of this column. There you have it. The sum is 93,000. So if you can think of the function itself as an oven, you can think of what are called arguments inside of these parentheses as the temperature, as the amount of ingredients, as the specific ingredients. In this case, the ingredients we're putting in are unique words, and we're having that baked into this wonderful product, which is essentially the sum of all of these values. So that's an introduction to Chapter 1 and all of the content. So again, just to review, that we do use in spreadsheet software arithmetic operators, and those follow the order of operations. So in this case, we're using division, but it's got it all: exponentiation, subtraction, addition, multiplication, etc., and parentheses, of course. And what's more, a bit of understanding of algebra is also extraordinarily helpful. And lastly, when it comes to data tables, they're comprised of columns, cells, and rows, and cells exist at the intersection of columns and rows, and inside them contain values. We're able to use the formula bar to be able to create transformations of existing values into new values, and we're also able to use functions to do more advanced transformations than what's limited to simply arithmetic operations, like in this case, division. So hopefully that's a good overview. Again, you just need a general understanding and to be somewhat brushed up and refreshed on arithmetic, on some basics of algebra, really basic algebra, order of operations, of course, and then some of these different features we've looked at, like formulas, being able to reference different cells, and lastly, functions, which are for advanced transformations. That should be able to cover everything in Chapter 1. Welcome to using spreadsheet software for data manipulation for more effective visualizations.